Recording in Hi, and welcome everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEUs. If you've joined us for this live episode and your state license requires live CEUs, please be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course, before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account. Here are the disclosures. Valerie James Abbott is employed by and receives a salary from Henrico Area Mental Health and Developmental Services. She's the author of a children's book, Potapillo. Valerie, help me. Is it Patapilla? I'm speaking Spanish. I think it's
It's both
Potapillo.
because it's in
Okay.
Spanish and English.
Okay. And receives royalties from its sale. She received compensation for a prior presentation from Speech Therapy PD. She's also the co-founder of the National Pediatric Late-Onset Hearing Loss Awareness Campaign, and she is an advisory committee member for Virginia Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program at the Virginia Department of Health. I am the founder and owner of BrainBridge Connect LLC, and as the host of this podcast and the presenter on other educational webinars for Speech Therapy PD, I do receive financial reimbursement. I am also the secretary and president-elect of the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat or the Q&A and will be answered throughout the podcast. We welcome our guest tonight, Valerie James Abbott, who is the parent of a child with late onset hearing loss. As a parent advocate and leader, she worked for the Center for Family Involvement at the Partnership for People with Disabilities at Virginia Commonwealth University, supporting families of children recently diagnosed with hearing loss. She also served as the first parent ever elected chair of the Virginia Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program Advisory Committee and led the nonprofit Hands and Voices Return to Virginia. Today, she stands alongside some of our country's leading experts calling for better outcomes for deaf and hard of hearing children by educating the public about early childhood hearing loss, promoting more frequent, effective hearing health screening between birth and school enrollment, and creating platforms for families like hers to share their experiences and find each other. Valerie, this is a long time in the making. I'm so grateful for you being with us. Thank you for being here. I'd love to start with you telling us about your journey from having, a child that was a typically developing child and then having your second daughter who obviously we're going to choose to have a lot of inspiration about both of their stories because they're really integral, I think, in um, kind of hearing where you're at right now, what you're doing right now, and why both of those pieces of the puzzle are so important.
Yes. Well, Renee, thank you so much for this invitation. We've been counting down the weeks to this and then the days. And we've talked about this opportunity for a while now. So I do have two daughters, and the first one, born with typical hearing, met the milestones, never thought about hearing health. And really the same goes for my second daughter. So my first daughter, Mary Claire, was born. Then my second one came 3 years later, uh, born typically past newborn hearing screening, had no reason to think about hearing health. We have no history of hearing loss or early childhood hearing loss in our family that we know of. And so, just like I would say, most families in our country, hearing health is not on the top of the list of things we're monitoring or paying attention to. And so when she was meeting all of the milestones that we were kind of keeping an eye on, um, we didn't notice when her speech and language skills started to go sideways because she was a chatterbox. And she did talk a lot, and she did sing, and she did scream, and she did interact with her sister and with us. And we were a very oral family, and that was our family culture, and she was buying into it. So I think it was easy for us to not notice the subtle but very significant signs of hearing loss in her toddlerhood. And so it wasn't until her preschool teacher, about 4 or 5 months in, when she was coming up on her third birthday, said to us during her parent-teacher conference that January, February, are you worried about her speech and language? And my husband and I said no, because we weren't concerned. We thought everything was pretty much where it should be. And she pointed out to us some things that were really concerning to her as a early childhood professional. And even then, we didn't think that much of it. We thought, okay, so maybe she's a little behind. And she was the one who recommended an evaluation by early intervention for speech. No one was thinking hearing at this point. And it was as a result of that referral to early intervention that we got fast tracked to a hearing assessment, not a screening, but a hearing assessment with a pediatric audiologist, and were immediately informed that she had moderate sloping to severe bilateral sensory neural hearing loss. So I've always credited the preschool teacher for bringing to our attention her developmental delay, not predicting what it might be, but that there was a delay there, and then early intervention for immediately recommending a hearing assessment and getting us lined up for that. So that's kind of was our entry into this whole world of early childhood hearing loss, and then specifically late onset hearing loss.
Yeah, and I think that's where you and I connected initially because I'm a parent of a preemie who was his sister. He's a second kid. His sister taught for him. Boys are notably slower with their language development typically, and so that's kind of where you and I connected initially when we talked, was that there were things that happened, even for me as a parent, where I wasn't concerned because, my daughter was my older child was a very verbal child, very language proficient so early. And so a lot of times they kind of had their secret language almost, where she would talk for him. So he didn't really need to talk as much or at length because you know, I can say this one thing and she knows what I'm saying.
Right,
So,
sure. And that's another way that late onset hearing loss can present, is that the older sibling is translating for the younger one, or there's so many subtle ways that this can manifest that parents don't recognize what's happening right in front of them.
hmm
Very educated families cannot understand what's happening right in front of them.
yeah. So, what would you say are some key facts? And we kind of go twofold here, key facts and myths. Let's start with the key facts about early childhood hearing loss that maybe are surprising to some people, other than those couple of little tidbits we just said.
Sure. So in the United States, it's estimated that somewhere between 2 and 3 out of 1,000 babies, newborns, enter the world and are identified as deaf or hard of hearing at birth. And we find many, but not all, but many of those children through newborn hearing screening. We've been able to
hmm
do that over the last 30, 40 years, and it's changed outcomes for countless deaf and hard of hearing individuals. But what many people don't realize is that the prevalence of hearing loss more than doubles between birth and school age.
hmm
And this has been reflected in a couple of different studies. The most recent one that I'm aware of is an article that was published in the International Journal of Audiology in 2024, August of 2024, for those of you who are interested in looking at that, which tells us that hearing loss can be present at birth, but it can also and does occur after that period just as frequently or more frequently between birth and school age. But generally speaking, in the United States, we are not screening children
Hmm.
on a global scale between birth and school age, unless there's a known risk factor, or if they're lucky, if their parent calls attention to a concern about hearing
Hmm.
or a concern about speech and language, and the right boxes are checked and the right people know that any concern about speech, language, or hearing by a parent is considered by the Joint Committee on Infant Hearing as a risk factor and should result in a hearing assessment, not a screen, but a hearing assessment. And so, why we screen all babies when we know that it's 2 to 3 in 1,000, and we don't screen children between birth and school age when it's the same number or more, is what the question mark I've been asking for a whole many years.
Hmm.
Um, that's one of the things. The other thing is that 1 in 200 babies born in the United States is exposed or infected to an infection, a virus called CCMV, cytomegalovirus. 1 in 200 babies. So think about the number of babies that is. And cytomegalovirus, when it is contracted in utero, is the number one thing that it can cause is hearing loss. And most cases, it's postnatal hearing loss. And that can occur anywhere from the day after birth to into teenagerhood. And the only way we can test for it to know if it was congenital CMV is within the first 21 days of life. And in most states, like 49, it's not universally tested for at birth. So that call for ongoing hearing health monitoring is huge because there are so many children who are exposed at birth to a virus that can cause late onset hearing loss is giant. And yet we're
Hmm.
still not doing anything. But there's no standard of care between birth and school age that is enough to find these children before kindergarten.
Well, and I think one of the things we've seen a recent uptick in the last 4 or 5 years is also cases of measles, and that's another space where we I should have prepared you. You're like, oh, measles is, and I say this mostly because I had measles as a child, but one of my daughter's best friends growing up, her dad had measles as a child, and he's quite a few years older than me, and he had hearing loss and also heart defects as a result of having contracted measles as a child. And I really don't know if he was vaccinated or not. I just know that by the time he was mid 50s, he'd had two heart valve replacements and had a significant hearing loss um, from that. So that's another virus that
Yeah.
we've seen in the last few years post COVID, where people are, and this is not a judgment, but people are choosing not to vaccinate and have for several years. But this is a public health concern because one of the results of having measles is the possibility that you could have postnatal hearing loss.
Yes, it is. I think with children who contract measles, which some children who contract measles is because they are not vaccinated.
Right.
Other children who contract measles are those that were vaccinated but are immunocompromised. My
Yes.
daughter is an example of that. She was vaccinated for chickenpox, but then contracted chickenpox because she's immunocompromised. And so Jay got a good old-fashioned 1970s case of it too, which was crappy. Um,
Yeah, I
so
had not
one of
fun.
those, yeah. So I say that because we are going to come across children who contract measles. But what I'm hoping is that children who contract measles, their pediatricians are aware of that, and so they are going to be hyper vigilant of monitoring their hearing following a diagnosis of measles.
Hmm.
Whereas with CMV, most of those children we don't know they even had it because We're not
Mhm.
universally screening for it. And in most cases, those babies come out asymptomatic looking when they're born.
Mhm. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So, what are some myths in early childhood hearing loss that maybe are a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but might be surprising? So, we talked about some facts, but then there's also myths that we kind of touched on that with, the older sibling translating or talking for the younger sibling. But what are some other things that maybe are uh, just not well known or things that you reflect back on that you're like, ah.
Yes. One of them is that children with hearing loss, um, that I would know. I have talked to speech SLPs with children who end up with hearing loss that is late identified, and they have said to me, I thought I would know.
Mm-hmm.
More than one, a few. And that feeling that they have of being educated in the field of speech and language, and yet they didn't recognize it in their own child carries a different type of gravity
Mm-hmm.
within them. So I thought, or um, a speech therapist that is working with the child on their speech, on their language, not enough progress is happening. They didn't think to insist on a hearing assessment, not a screen, a hearing assessment. So time goes by, then they're like, okay, let's get hearing, let's determine. And then hearing loss is discovered and they think I really thought I would have noticed that. Um, so this concept of I would know,
Mm-hmm.
I'll know and I would know. The number of times I've come across speech therapists that have confided in me and made that comment, and the number of times that I've come across speech therapists that say that, it is a myth. You
Mm-hmm.
won't know necessarily because the signs and symptoms can be so subtle. They don't all go mute. They don't all stop talking. For example, my daughter could not shut up. You see pictures of her and she's screaming all the time. And it's because she was using a very distorted version of English that she used proficiently and that we understood proficiently if she could see our face. The idea that children with hearing loss don't startle to noise, they can.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that I'll know it when I see it, that can be a myth. Um, one ear is enough. One ear is not enough. Students who have unilateral hearing loss are
Mm-hmm.
7 to 10 times more likely to fail a grade than typical hearing peers.
Yeah.
And anybody who's interested in where that data comes from, reach out to me and I will point you to where that is.
Mm-hmm.
That is an old mindset that we are trying to change because we know now that that is not enough. It's not enough. And if we look at toddlers with unilateral hearing loss, their speech frequently isn't affected,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're talking just like their sister and their preschool. So their speech is not necessarily affected. But once they get into school and they are responsible for knowledge and incidental learning, just as much what's happening on this side as this side, that's where we start to see the difference. And we still have audiologists and others that are telling parents of moderate, severe, profound hearing loss on one side, don't worry, one ear is enough. That's a myth.
That's like saying one eye is enough. I mean, it's a stereo sound system. So, yeah, that's
Incidental
why,
learning, it's the incidental learning is really where we see the impact. And so you don't notice it in
yeah.
the toddlers and the preschoolers where you really see it Where you really start to see it is in school, where they're now being measured on what they're learning and responsible for what they're learning. And that's where we find it. And is that when we start to pay attention to it and say, well, one ear isn't enough? That should have been a conversation and a belief that we started from the very beginning.
Well, and even thinking about, people with normal hearing, I'll give an example from, we just had our July 4th holiday, and, I have neighbors who do their own fireworks shows. And
Mm.
it's hard when the sound acoustics outside are impacted by um, foliage on the tree, the wind, the weather, the humidity. And people think that's not an actual thing. But it was hard the other night when I was here listening to fireworks outside to figure out without the visual of, okay, it sounds like it's over here, but it's actually occurring over here. And I know that's not the same thing, but I think it's a good example of we all are impacted by acoustics and environmental noise, things that we're not necessarily predicting. And so when you mentioned startle, that's kind of triggered it for me, is that you're not going to get everything if you're hearing only a snippet or a part.
Mhm.
It's kind of like the old telephone game we used to play in school or Sunday school or wherever you played it, where someone has to tell you the thing that they heard, but everyone's perception is different. So if you're a child and or a toddler and your perception is different, that's going to translate, and especially if it's not something that's diagnosed or recognized when you are learning, it's going to go all throughout your learning career into high school and then possibly, and I think that's where we'll head into at some point into college because Brady is now in college.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's so interesting to think about how we experience this as normal hearing adults. Think about traffic noise, think about emergency sirens or whatever that it is. It's hard sometimes if you have background noise or if you're you know, Valerie and I are both in Virginia. It's hot here. We got the air on in the car. I'm not rolling my windows down right now.
Hmm.
So it's hard to
Hmm.
hear we hear the sirens, right? We know we need to pull over, but we're not sure sometimes where that's coming from. Is it behind us? Is it in front to the left? Where is it? So sound location is a big thing for all of us. But when you think about a child who like you so well mentioned, um, trying to hear on both sides of their head, and they're trying to learn these other things and not only learn it but comprehend it, decipher it, break it down so that they can decode what they're hearing is such a huge part of that learning experience.
Yeah. And then the last myth I'll mention has to do with um, that amplification and specifically cochlear implants. Now, my daughter uses hearing aids and has since she was just before she was 3. But amplification, specifically cochlear implants, work, for just about everybody, every child that has them and gets them. That is a myth. Auditory verbal therapy is really, really important
Mhm.
part of the acquisition of language for those families that want their children to take an oral or spoken language route. And so giving a child technology that gives them access to sound, but not partnering that with therapies that will help that child know what to do with that access to sound.
Mhm.
It's not a miracle. It doesn't just naturally happen, especially for children who use cochlear implants. And so the myth that I think many families buy into or believe is that if my child gets a cochlear implant, they will naturally hear and everything will be fine. And that is a myth. There is a lot more that goes into that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is important for professionals who are working with those families to help those parents um, connect them with the resources to help them be most informed on the truths behind what technology can offer their child and what it can't, and what the investment on their end as parents needs to be so that they can make the best decision for their child and for their family. And I just have seen too many children who are without language, not because they weren't offered technology, they were, but that the other really equally important part of investing in the therapies that are needed to utilize that technology were not the child didn't get them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that people might be asking, if you're listening about halfway through now is, why are we talking about this? Is because, these kids grow into adults, and guess what? They often will have other medical issues along the way. And so for me, I've had adult patients with cochlear implants. I've had adult patients who were ASL speakers, who weren't completely deaf, but that was their modality. And it was important to, know what their journey was, to help them communicate their health needs, to help them communicate their health literacy needs. And so that's one of the reasons why I felt so strongly about having you on the podcast, because you're now the parenting journey. Bridie's not 8. She's not 15 anymore. She's now moved into this new realm of college. And um, I think often when we hear childhood hearing loss or a child gets a cochlear implant, we're like, oh, that's great, cool. The end.
Everything's good now.
Yeah,
Everything's going to
everything's
be great for
good.
her now. Good. That's
It's good.
wonderful. And like you're good now, mom. You should be, you should have a lot more free time,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, or it's similar to the parents of anyone with a different ability, where at some point the parent may need to be declared the guardian of a child who's now of legal age. And people really just, and this doesn't necessarily mean that's your situation, but I think people need to understand it's not a one size fits all. And that's really why I felt strongly about having this conversation with you, because it is not something that we're discussing often. Like with other caregiver roles, we're not talking enough about these things where the general public has this knowledge and can say, oh, wow, okay, I need to change what I'm doing to help this family or this person, because I'm the professional, but yet I didn't get this in my educational journey. I'm not seeing this patient population consistently, or this is not my specialty area. But that doesn't matter, because when you work in the medical field of SLP throughout your career, as I have, you never know what's going to pop up tomorrow. You just
Well, I think if
don't.
you look at statistics and you look at that, the prevalence of hearing loss between birth
Hmm.
and school age, more than doubling, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and you kind of start doing the math, and then you look at the CDC's number, which is, I think they say 14.9% of students between the ages of 6 through 19
Yeah.
have enough hearing loss to impact them academically. Now, granted, that's all kinds of hearing loss. That's not just sensory neural, it's conductive, it's mixed, it's, all of that. But that's a lot of right? That's a lot of students. And so if you're working with children, you probably are going to come across those with late onset. You just might not know it. And the question that I pose for all of you who are listening, either now or later on, is do you know the age of onset of the students that you're working with, the children that you're working with? And why might that be important to know? Not specifically the age, oh, the child was 2 or the child was 4, but was the hearing loss present at birth? Was the hearing loss occur, acquired after birth? Does the
Hmm.
family even know? And why would that, as a professional, be important to know for you as a professional? Because there are reasons. There's honestly, from a trauma-informed care perspective, reasons to know.
Yes. Yeah, and literacy too. Literacy, reading, being able to not, people think of literacy as auditory comprehension, but if you can't hear the sound, you can't decode it when you read it. And people have such a hard time with that.
So let me talk for a minute about Bridie's literacy journey
Hmm.
because it's so, when people think about what we had to do for her,
Hmm.
because she was late identified, because she had learned a very distorted version of English that she had become proficient in, we had just had to decide, what do we want for her language to be? How did we want her to communicate? And I, at the time, was, you just tell me what I'm supposed to do. Somebody who's a professional, tell me what we are supposed to do and we will do it. Are we supposed to learn ASL? Because we can do that. Are we supposed to, just tell me what we're supposed to do? And so when we settled on, we wanted her to uh, be an oral communicator because we were a very oral communicating family. That was what we wanted. Okay. But how do we take a child that was fluent in a very distorted version of English and have
Hmm.
her unlearn that while simultaneously learning English from scratch?
Yeah.
How how do you do that? And the strategy that was proposed to us was very controversial, and we were told there are going to be some people who go, "What the heck are you doing?" And if this is the strategy that I, as the therapist, am recommending that we try. If you feel comfortable with it, we can try it. If it works, it doesn't, whatever. And so um, it's the trauma that families of late identified children go through is askew for some of us than those whose children are identified at birth, where this child enters the world, enters the family, and they know this about their child from almost the very beginning, versus those that think they know their child and have this big discovery later on, a year old, 2, 3, 6, 8, where you thought you knew and you didn't, and you have this panic, guilt, remorse, like all of this new list of things. And as a professional, you are there in the middle of all of this mess, or maybe years later, but that trauma is still with that family and they're carrying it with them. And you're seeing manifestations of that. How are you handling that? Um, it's just something I think professionals need to be aware of as they're working with families, is that late identification experience that families of children with late onset hearing loss have, that is very unique and in some cases different than children who are born deaf or hard of hearing.
Yeah, no, and I think that is, I'm a huge proponent of trauma-informed care. So I love that you just said that because I think, the difference between late onset hearing loss and late identified hearing loss, people mix those up and they're not necessarily the same thing.
No, late identified hearing loss is defined as any hearing loss that is identified after the newborn hearing screening time frame, which is generally after a year.
Hmm.
And so that may be a child that failed the newborn hearing screening and then disappeared into the wind and is identified at 2. So we can look back and say that child probably, was deaf at birth or, whatever. We can look back and we know because of a syndrome, we know, but they were late identified because we did not get a diagnosis until they were 2. All children with late onset hearing loss, which goes by lots of different terms, by the way, late onset, delayed onset, postnatal, acquired, it's got a lot of different names. Um, all of those children are late identified by the nature of what it is. But we can't assume that all late identified children um, were those kids that didn't make it through the NICU, through the newborn hearing screening. They're the ones that were missed. No, some of them. And then a lot of these late identified children, we will never know.
Hmm.
But they are two different terms, different definitions.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great space to, and you alluded to the article earlier that was published in the International Journal of Audiology in August of 2024. But what you didn't allude to was that you had a role in that article and what that article is, and then also those key findings that were identified.
Yes. So I think it was back in I don't even know, 2021, 2022, when I was doing some presenting with Dr. Carl White, who
Hmm.
is the founder and executive director of NCHAM, the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management, and Dr. Dylan Chan, who is a pediatric ENT and researcher out of UCSF, University of California, San Francisco. And his big thing is research about early childhood hearing loss. And so they were very supportive of me as a parent advocate about late onset hearing loss uh, and my mission. And so one of the questions that I had been bouncing around, they had been bouncing around in their groups was, what actually is the prevalence of late identification, like late identified kids? What actually is the prevalence? And so, or late onset hearing loss. And so they got a couple people together to bounce this idea around and invited me to the table, which I was so grateful for. And they said, you know what, let's do a literature review. And they invited me to the table. And I was so grateful because, especially Carl White is a big proponent of having family voices at the table whenever possible. And they
Right.
knew that I would show up at the table. So I did. And it was a 2-year process. And I showed up at every meeting and I asked questions and I participated. And then when the time came to actually, do this comparison and this literature research and stuff, and they said, "Do you want to do some of this?" And I said, "I'd really love to because I want to see how this is done. I want to see how this type of research is done." And so I had a partner so that I was sure that I didn't mess up their statistics. And what was nice was actually it was right in line with what everybody else was doing. And these were really the nation's top researchers in pediatric hearing health. And what we found were some big inconsistencies in how research is being done around the world. And it really was frustrating. And which is good to know. It was really good to know. But what also was what we figured out is there are some big key statements that we can say. And one of them is that there are no systems of care in place in the United States for screening children
Mhm.
in any state or US territory between the ages of birth and school age. It's not happening. And part of the reason for that is that the American Academy of Pediatrics doesn't recommend hearing screening until the 4-year well child checkup. They don't recommend it. And there's no research anywhere, no data anywhere to indicate is it happening and if it's happening, by what means is it happening, and what are they finding? So that was one of the things. The other,
Oh,
yeah, and so there were a bunch of things that they found as a result of this. And so they also pointed out some important things about statements within the Joint Committee on Infant Hearing that might not be being held up, some recommendations that really should be. So there were some really great key statements that we can leverage from that. One of them being we need to be doing some research on this that is all consistent. So, for example, a lot of the research that was done pulled out children with unilateral hearing loss. Like, why would you do that? Why would you eliminate from your study all of the children with unilateral hearing loss? Or they pulled out all the children with mild hearing loss. We're not going to include those in our numbers. What? So that's what I mean is they couldn't compare apples to apples because different research was pulling out different kids. And
mm-hmm.
so how do you come up with a number for prevalence when you can't compare all of the data sources? So I do encourage everybody to look at that. Just look up prevalence of late onset hearing loss, or Valerie James Abbott, prevalence of late onset, then you'll really find it fast because they did list me as a co-author. And I think part of the reason for that was because I did show up to every single meeting and I did contribute to that research. And I think part of the reason they even started in the first place was because I kept knocking on all of their doors saying, I have questions, and why are we not talking about this more?
Yeah. Well, again, your journey has been one from, you're now the parent of two adults. So, so you've had this journey of years now where you've had these questions and weren't finding answers and were hitting brick walls at times, but and kudos, and I say kudos only because I also know you a little bit personally, but kudos because if not you, then who's going to advocate? And so I really applaud you for that because I know you well enough to know you don't want to take credit for that necessarily, but at the same time, you want to take credit because if this changes someone else's experience into something that has better access to care, better access to health literacy, breaking down barriers and doors, then yeah, I think you would knock down walls and buildings and probably
You
blow
know,
some stuff up.
I will, and I'll tell you why. Because people say, what has gotten you so fired up for all this time? Because this is years now.
Yeah.
And this is what it is I thought for many years that our journey, our experience was typical, was normal. That
Mhm.
children with postnatal hearing loss, they go to preschool. The preschool teacher says something to the parents. The parents are like, not really worried about it. They recommend a referral to, early intervention. The parents go to early intervention. Early intervention says, I think you should get a hearing evaluation. The hearing evaluation happens. Hearing loss is identified. They're quickly connected to, you know, hearing aids or cochlear implants, and then they start, and then all of that. I discovered in the years that followed that we are the unicorn, that we're the anomaly,
Mhm.
that most families of children with late onset hearing loss don't have it like that, that their experiences are are traumatic,
Mhm.
that they don't get identified like that, that their children's language doesn't get turned around, that they don't arrive in kindergarten ready, that their children are always behind, that they don't graduate with a typical diploma, that their children don't end up going to college, that they end up those statistics that we hear about how few deaf and hard of hearing students end up going to college or graduating from college, that they're underemployed because we didn't find them in time.
Mhm.
And in the research that I've done in the last year and a half speaking with late identified families and hearing their stories and their struggles to getting a diagnosis. And then once they got a diagnosis, getting connected to resources and to other families and figuring out, how do I do this? Um, I was incensed to realize all these years later that we are no better as a country to advocating for better um, pediatric hearing monitoring, screening, assessments of children between birth and school age than we were when my daughter had this experience 18 years ago. Hard to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And and but we see the fruits of our experience now. And I've seen the fruits of that experience, even though it's been difficult. Don't get me wrong. The number of tears that have been shed between her identification and graduating from high school, I can't, that's a whole other podcast, because there were several struggles along the way, big ones. But the fact is, at the end of the day, she was kindergarten ready with language.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference. That is what helped make a difference. That's why she is a rising senior at her college of choice. That's why she's dreaming after college of moving to Austin, Texas, and making a life for herself. That's why she's applied for a hearing dog, and she's in the final stages of that process so that she can live independently and sleep soundly, independent by herself. These are her
Love
dreams. This
that.
is what we wanted, is because
Yes.
we found her in time to turn her around with the support of auditory verbal therapists and speech therapists, so that when she entered kindergarten with an IEP and sufficient oral English that everyone could understand, we couldn't shut her up yet again. And she was on the path for the ability to learn along with everybody else. When I learned that that is not the typical experience of children with late onset hearing loss, years later,
Yeah.
there's no excuse. Our country has no excuse. And so I am on fire for the parents that, for many reasons, they have to focus on their own child. They have to
Mm-hmm.
focus on figuring things out the way that I did, even though I didn't know. And so you focus on your child, and I'm going to focus on figuring out, how do I improve things for all of you.
Mm. Ugh, love that. So let's talk about late to the party. Um, I think that, the article that you were a part of was so good, but I'm so excited for you because you do have the children's book that you wrote based on Bridie's experience in the language piece. But I think what you've done with Late to the Party is just fantastic. So talk to us about, like, where did this come from other than your fire?
Yes.
What
Well,
happened to prompt this?
yes. So the article that was published in the International Journal of Audiology was amazing, and an amazing experience for me personally. But the question that I was asking myself the whole time, and then ultimately when it was published, was, this is a wonderful piece. This is a wonderful piece, but the general public is not going to find this.
Mm-hmm.
And the general public is not going to see the key statements that are in here, the powerful key statements that are in here. So, how do I, as a parent advocate, as a champion for late onset hearing loss, for a lot of different things, how am I going to get these messages out into the bigger world? And that's where the idea behind it started off as, how am I going to create a collage of stories that would bring this study, this published piece, into the rest of the world. And so that's where the idea behind Late to the Party came. And I knew that I didn't want, or didn't feel that it needed to include our family story, because I think enough people have heard of my family story. And that our family story was a success from the beginning. And so it wasn't really reflective of the way most families were experiencing things. So I put out a call in March of 2020. 5, I guess it was, and said, I'm going to write a book, and this is what it's going to be about. And no joke, it was overnight. I had families submitting short, synopsis about their experiences, and I had to turn off the inbox real quick because there were stories coming from all over the place. And so we ended up with 16 unbelievable stories from families of late identified children, representing 19 children. So there were some multiple late identified children,
Multiple. Yeah.
some that were identified in the same family but not in birth order. And the the they're unbelievable. They're unbelievable, and yet they're true. And so I interviewed them over the course of a whole summer, and then started imagining, how am I going to be the narrator of these gifts? And it took everything out of me as a parent and as a storyteller. And I'm so grateful to these parents for and in some cases to the older siblings that still remember that time. And so it really was the hardest thing I've ever done, um, as a writer, but also as a parent, um, to 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 do this. And when Carl White with NCHAM, when I reached out to him, kind of told him what I was up to, and asked if he would consider writing the foreword. He asked for a couple of the chapters that were still in progress. And then he said, send me a couple more. And I did. And he's like, hell yeah, let's do this. And so he wrote the foreword, and his foreword is pretty forward. And he's like, people, there's no excuse for this. There's no excuse. And so
Yeah.
I'm grateful for his support and endorsement. But at the end of the day, it really does, um, I think it doesn't point the finger at people. It points the finger at us, all of us, to say,
Mhm.
what can I be doing more of, less of, differently to find these children sooner? And
Yeah.
that
Well, it speaks to a broken system.
it speaks to a broken system of which we are all connected. Um, so I'm very proud of it, and I hope that we all, when we read it, we look at it with grace to the families that have put everything on the table. They left nothing in the dark. They took, in many cases, they took responsibility for the parts and pieces where, they dropped the ball. But in general, it's a great reflective opportunity for us, as for those of us who are professionals, for those of us who are parents, to look and say, where do I see myself in this system? How can I improve things? But for parents of recently identified children, for them to realize you are so not alone. And yes, you're late to the party, but so are the thousands of other families behind you and in front of you. You are part of a big, big group of people. We are all late to the party, and we welcome you with open arms. And, welcome to this crazy broken system of which we're all a part.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good space to talk about. You describe the book as an advocacy project. So what are some things that you really hope will come from this other than obviously better systems? Because that's so generic, right? We can say
Yeah.
better systems, but what does that actually mean?
If I could dream big, and I do, I dream big all the time,
Dream big.
is, all right, so this is it. Everybody listening now, everyone who's going to hear this recorded, okay? Um, for the rest of my birthdays for my lifetime, this is what I want for my birthday, and yours too. Every child who is seen for speech or language delay between the ages of birth and school age, I want you to know their current hearing status, not their
Sure.
newborn hearing screening.
Mhm.
That's good. That's good to know. Their
Right.
current hearing status, not a screen, current hearing status. Don't make assumptions. Don't do the one from 2 years ago, current hearing status, because that's one of the ways we're going to find them. That's one of the ways we're going to find them. I would like for pediatricians to stop taking the request for a referral to a audiologist away from the parents and putting it to the side. There are far too many examples in the book and that I've heard over the years of parents that went to the pediatrician and said, I think my child might not be able to hear me. Can I get a referral to an audiologist? Or what do you think? And they're like, I'm not worried about it. Let's wait and see. Let's wait and see. The pediatricians in many cases are a barrier. I would like to see that dissolve. I would like to see every time a parent comments on their child's hearing, a concern about their child's hearing, a request for a referral for audiology, that pediatrician puts that child on the fast track. I think we would find children that way too.
Yeah.
And I would like every child that goes through early intervention and is found eligible for services under the category of a language delay to automatically go for a hearing assessment, not a screening, a hearing assessment. And there are multiple different groups that is what is supposed to be happening. It's supposed to be happening. It's not. It's not. But for my birthday from June of this year, for the rest of my life, I would like for that to happen, because I think if those three things happened, I think we would see a giant increase in the number of children that we identify before school age. Just those three changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, people don't think about that and how it translates into adulthood. I see adult patients I'm 17 and up for the most part. But I think one of the reasons that it's so important is because you described, your experiences. You guys were able to get an identification. You were able to do other things, have good resources, figure the system out, figure out what your family needed and what Bridie needed. And so Bridie she's a really a good success story, which I think is hopeful for a lot of people. Um, and maybe a lot of people don't know about Bridie because, I know you say everybody knows about your family, but tell us what Bridie's doing now, because you mentioned she's in college. She's a rising senior.
Yes.
That's so crazy because I feel like when I met you, she was in high school still.
Right. Yes.
And
Yes.
so she's got hopes and dreams, and she's got these systems in place that she can do that. So there is hope. And I think ending the podcast on a hopeful note and saying this can be a success.
Yes. So she is a rising senior at the college of her choice. Um, School K through 12 was not easy for her at all. And I think part of it had to do with her hearing loss. Part of it did not have to do with her hearing loss. But socially, she did fairly well because she was and still is a pretty loud and proud, hard of hearing person. She's
Yeah.
just like, this is it. Like, I have a freckle. She considers it, her hearing loss and her hearing aids, to be like a freckle. Kind of like, if you don't like it, don't look at it. Like, it's very matter of fact. Like what, like what's, whatever. Um, and so she has big dreams for herself. She wants to be very independent. She is very independent. She came out of the womb very independent. And she now recognizes, especially now that she's imagining herself living independently, this idea of being able to live alone and the risks that come with that as a individual with hearing loss. What does she need to do to be successful at that? And this idea of a hearing dog, we've discussed it, and so she's been in that process now for about a year and a half, and so she's actively thinking through, what do I need to do as an adult to live independently and succeed and be able to provide for myself and all of these things, and I credit all of that with discovering her hearing loss early enough to turn her around, her language around for kindergarten readiness, kindergarten readiness, kindergarten readiness. And I think that is the truth for almost all of our children. Now, children who are deaf plus, so deaf plus some other additional disability or concern, that may not be the case for them. But for children with hearing loss, if we can have them be kindergarten ready alongside their typical hearing peers, they're capable of absolutely anything. And Bridie is famous, and she'll tell you this. You can have podcasts. She throws me under the train tracks all the time, where I did not believe that she is capable of lots of things. And she proved me wrong every single time.
Yeah.
And why did I think she wasn't capable of it? Because she has a disability called hearing loss. I will admit it. And there's several examples of it, and she proved me wrong every single time. And so she is the one who will tell parents, just talk to my mom. She'll tell you, don't underestimate what your child can do because you'll be wrong. Just wait and see. But again, why? Because she was kindergarten ready.
Mm-hmm.
So anything we all can do together to help as many children who are deaf and hard of hearing with late onset hearing loss, or really any hearing loss, to be kindergarten ready, it starts with finding them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I still, Bridie's spirit is like contagious.
It
So
is. It
that's,
is. You'll
that's
know
a
her
big
when you
part of
see
it.
her. Yeah,
That's a big part of
yeah,
it.
yeah, she's a bubble.
Yeah. We had a couple of comments, not necessarily questions, but just thank you for the resources on your website from KK. Hey, KK, thanks for being here. Terry, thank you for such an informative wake up call. Wishing your birthday wishes to come true. I'll be more diligent at this moment on. Appreciate that. And Joni, I never heard of CCMV before, and I was glad to learn of that affecting 1 out of 200 preschoolers. Yeah, so that the cytomegalovirus I had heard of, having been, especially being the mom of a preemie. Yeah, I knew about that, and I knew that's what you were gonna say about that because it is something that so not looked at because if the baby doesn't come out and present with these, you don't fail um, their autoacoustic emissions test in Virginia at least, there no one's going to look and see these other things. And
The
so,
impact it can have on vision, on
yes,
feeding, on hearing, on everything
yeah,
is huge.
yeah. And I think from what I understand too, a lot of times that is also like measles can be associated with some heart
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
anomalies, some
So
cardiac
many
anomalies.
things.
Yeah,
Microcephaly, all sorts of things.
yeah, yeah. So it's, there's a lot of work to be done in a lot of realms of what we do as professionals, but I think you being such a strong advocate for parents and being that loud voice in the quiet room, I applaud you for that. I know you don't want to necessarily hear the accolades, but it's important because it makes a difference. We are fortunate in our Commonwealth of Virginia to have legislators who are willing to meet with us and listen to our advocacy efforts and um, really learn because that's another place where a lot of people don't realize they assume that medical professionals, meaning a lot of times physicians or primary care team members who are nurse practitioners or physician assistants and legislators, we assume that they know and they're just not acting. And 9 times out of 10, that is not the case. Our medical professionals do not get a huge neuro course. They don't certainly get a huge course. They get a basic course on pediatrics. They don't get the nitty gritty, the details. They don't know what they don't know. Same thing with our legislators. So if you're not advocating at those two levels, if you're the professional or the parent, you're really missing an avenue for advocacy because we think that these people just know all the things and they really don't. They really
That's right.
don't. So it's our
That's right.
role, our job to be the loud noise in the quiet room and be the squeaky wheel.
Well, now you have a whole group of people that can be the squeaky wheel because I can't be the only one. So we can all be loud voices in the quiet room.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Well, Valerie, you already know I love you. So I appreciate you so much for joining us, for sharing all this information, for the continued advocacy, for bringing Late to the party so that you're amplifying others' voices as well. It's so important. And I really applaud you and appreciate you for being with us.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks so much.
Of course. And if you've joined us for this live episode and your state license requires live CEUs, be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account.